Hey, I know I'm recording a bunch of chapters today, but I want to know what's happening, so I keep reading. When we read last, they had found Peony, and Mrs. Aggervin had been tricked into thinking she'd won a cruise, and the police were at Mrs. Aggervin's apartment rescuing Peony, and Marzana and JJ and Meddy were headed home with Marzana's mom, and Marzana was in trouble. So here we go. Chapter 19, Rum Things. The big grandfather clock in the entry hall at Hedgelock was chiming 10 when Marzana, Meddy, and Mrs. Hacklebairn trudged in at last. After leaving Mrs. Aggervin's flat, their timing had been abysmal. They arrived at the bus stop just as the bus to the 10 Churches neighborhood was pulling away, and despite JJ's protests, Marzana's mom had insisted on waiting with him for the next one. This resulted in their missing the bus that passed closest to the viaduct, which followed a different route and had a stop 4 blocks away, and having to wait 20 minutes for another. But even that bus didn't go all the way to the neighborhood on the pointless bridge, so after they'd gotten as close as public transportation would take them, Meddy and Marzana and her mom had a 20-minute walk to get home at last. Honora appeared from the dining room as they entered. She took one look at the expression on Marzana's and her mother's faces and folded her tattooed arms over her apron. "Ha! Did squash night take an unexpected turn?" "It did," Mrs. Hucklebairn said through clenched teeth. "I could stand a pot of coffee in the study, Honora, if you're not busy." She glanced down at Meddy. "Oh, and you should know we have a guest." Meddy huffed. "Fine." She turned toward Honora, and as before, when she'd shown herself to the members of the thief knot, there was nothing to indicate she'd done anything. Only Honora's reaction told Marzana that Meddy had made herself visible. Or really, Honora's non-reaction. The steward merely tilted her head, muttered, "Well, that's a rum thing if a thing ever was," and vanished into the kitchen. Meddy humphed again. Then she glanced back at Marzana and her mother. "I'll find somewhere else to be." She disappeared down the hall toward the parlor. Mrs. Hacklebairn looked at Marzana. "Let's go have a talk." Marzana sighed and followed her mother up the stairs. In the study, Mrs. Hacklebairn dropped tiredly onto the chaise lounge and rubbed her hands fiercely over her eyes. Marzana sat tentatively on the edge of the chair opposite the chaise and waited for the inevitable. "Am I grounded?" she asked at last. Her mother looked up. "Have I ever grounded you?" "No." "Do I need to ground you?" "No," Marzana repeated quickly. "Good, because I don't think I have the bandwidth right now. But I'd like to know what the heck you 3 thought you were doing." She paused, shook a finger. "Not 3, because obviously Cyril wasn't in on it too, hence the cell phone, and Nyala, because you 2 are the Bobbsey twins. Who else? Am I missing anyone?" "I have no idea who the Bobbsey twins are," Marzana said, attempting dignity. "And yes, there was one other person. Amelia Cabot. She's in the cormorantcy at Merrymead." She watched her mother's face. "I think you maybe knew her dad." Mrs. Hacklebairn nodded. "Alex Cabot's kid. That makes a kind of sense. Does she know everything too?" "Pretty much." "Okay. What is that, 6 of you? Good grief." She rubbed her eyes again. "I repeat, what the heck do you think you were doing?" Marzana crossed her arms and raised her shoulders. "Same thing you were, trying to help." Mrs. Hacklebairn made an exasperated noise. "Nothing ever happens here, Mom," Marzana protested, "and you and Dad with your deniability thing." Her mother interrupted in a deadly tone. "Excuse me. I know you're not about to suggest that you got up to whatever you got up to because I didn't cut you in on a job, Marzana." She erupted into a short burst of laughter. "That's almost funny." Marzana watched her mother warily. This was some weird conversational territory. Was she in trouble or not? But her mother composed herself in a heartbeat, and when she spoke, it was in that very dangerous tone again. "I'm waiting." Definitely trouble. I thought you and Dad weren't really focusing on whether Peony was in the Liberty or not. You were just focused on tracking down Emmett's suspects. So I thought maybe it wouldn't be bad if I looked at it from that side. If someone did bring her in, how they could have done it. And I figured maybe the below ground. So I called Milo. Ah, that's where Meddy came into it. Yes, I was looking for a way to get in touch with his friend who's the below-ground conductor. I never did manage to get a hold of him. Marzana paused as her mother shook her head in disbelief, then plowed on, feeling a bit defensive now. That had been a good idea, even if she hadn't managed to follow it up. But we had another lead. Mrs. Agravin didn't come in on Tuesday, and we got a substitute teacher whose usual school is Watermill, the one where Peony went. Mrs. Hacklebaron sat up straighter. Really? Yes, and then Meddy found out that Mrs. Agravin hadn't actually contacted the school about her absence herself, and that they hadn't been able to get a hold of her. So we decided we'd just check on her. We did, and there she was, Peony, and there you were. And that's all? Mrs. Hacklebaron prompted. Marzana sighed and spilled. Well, Nyala thought there might be a message hidden in the ransom note, or a message the ransom note points to, but she hasn't found one yet. Ciro's granddad designed a bunch of below-ground stops, and there might actually be a private one in Marymead. And there's a whole thing with cormorants that we hadn't totally figured out. Cormorants? Her mother leaned forward, interested. Where'd you come across that name? Everywhere, Marzana exploded. The Marymead station, if there is one, was designed by Ezra Cormorant, who married one of the Cotgraves. His picture's up with the trustee portraits at school, along with a handful of others. Yes, I've seen those, her mother said. I know the Cormorants are still trustees, but what did Ezra and the station have to do with Peony? Nothing, maybe, but we noticed Ezra's name on the station blueprints because we'd seen a different Cormorant name, Victor Cormorant. Mrs. Hacklebaron gave her a hard look. You'd seen his name, or you'd heard it mentioned here at home? Marzana couldn't restrain herself. After all, the knot had figured this connection, but fair and square. And if there was any justice, her mother would have to be just a little bit impressed. You never said it, she pointed out. Neither did Emmett. Not when I was in the room, anyway. You used his other moniker. We found Victor Cormorant's name in the substitute teacher's employee file. She decided not to mention she'd also seen it in her parents' notes. And you put the two names together? How? I looked up snakebird in a birding book, and the entry mentioned cormorants. Marzana said, raising her chin. One corner of her mother's mouth twitched upward, grudgingly impressed. Amelia saw the entry and realized she knew they were the same person. I guess from her dad's work. All right, go back to the file. What was Cormorant's name doing in it? He recommended the substitute personally, the one who's been filling in for Mrs. Agravin. Meddy says that according to the teachers, Victor was in the offices when someone called to say Mrs. A wasn't coming in, and he recommended Mr. Otterwill there and then. And Mr. Otterwill told us, Nyala and me, that it was his great-uncle who'd gotten him the job. They're related. Well, that is fascinating, Mrs. Hacklebaron said, folding her arms and leaning back into her chair. Because Victor's how your father and I wound up at Mrs. Agravin's house. Your dad had been watching the flat since late last night. So her mother had reached out to him after all. Only the night before, Mrs. Hacklebaron had still been talking about reaching out to his granddaughter instead. And somehow he was the reason they'd wound up at Mrs. Agravin's? What was the connection there? Weirdest of all, they'd been watching the apartment last night. They'd left Peony in there alone and afraid all night? Mom, Marzana asked in disbelief, what were you waiting for? Her mother raised an eyebrow. You mean when you went in like total Leroy? What's a Leroy? Her mother waved a hand. We had a guy on the crew of the Lancet named Leroy. He'd just go running headlong into whatever situation. She paused as Honora came in with a tray bearing 2 pots and 2 mugs, along with cream and sugar. Like to quote Horatio Nelson and Jack Aubrey at us. Never mind maneuvers, just go straight at him. But really, I think he just had this romantic idea about how pirates ought to be. Sorry, that wasn't Honora talking. That was Mrs. Hacklebaron. I'm going to do that again. Like to quote Horatio Nelson and Jack Aubrey at us. Never mind maneuvers, just go straight at him. But really, I think he just had this romantic idea about how pirates ought to be. Leroy Jenkins, Honora muttered, pouring coffee from the bigger pot, then cider from the smaller. You weren't pirates, though, Marzana protested. Try telling that to Leroy, Honora said. Will there be anything else, Captain? Not at the moment, thank you. Honora saluted and left. But you were asking about why we hadn't gone in after Peony yet. her mother continued as she doctored her coffee. The answer is, well, there are two answers. The first is we hadn't seen any truly suspicious activity in the house. We were watching to see if anyone came or went. You were just going to leave her in there? Marzana demanded, alone and scared, just in case someone showed up you could capture? Well, no. Remember, we didn't think anyone would have risked bringing the actual hostage to the Liberty. We had no idea she was there at all. Your dad and I were watching for one of the conspirators. And by the way, there was another reason we decided watching and waiting was the best course of action. We felt that something was off. It was too easy, finding our way to that building. Too easy? Marzana couldn't help but feel a little insulted. After all, she and the knot had followed leads to the same place, and she'd been fairly proud of the information they'd tracked down to get there. You asked, her mother smiled a little. I don't know how to explain it, except that it felt like someone had left a trail of crumbs. Some of them false, we think Rob Ganrider was one of those, and some of them, like the snake bird, Victor, moving us more directly to the next crumb, to move us to the next screen. Except, she shrugged, except then there was Peony in Mrs. Agrivan's flat. So apparently I'm wrong, and you, my girl, were right. A rum thing if ever there was, to quote Honora. Her face went severe again. Don't think that means I'm still not furious. But the kid's on her way to home, and that's what matters. Are you going to be able to find out who did it, though? Mrs. Hacklebaron shook her head. Not me. Liberty Police Forensics will do their job. Your dad and I will talk to Emmett and his friend and give them everything we have, and everything you have, if you please, holding nothing back. Marzana nodded. I promise. Downstairs, the front doorbell buzzed. Her mother groaned. That'll be Nick. I hope to God he's here because he got an update from your dad and not because he's got one of Emmett's suspects in tow. I don't think I have it in me to deal with anything else tonight. She sighed and stretched. Anyway, maybe they'll find the goons who took Peony. Maybe they won't, but she's safe. And I'll just have to decide to be okay with my weird feelings about the whole thing. She didn't sound like she'd totally made up her mind about that, though. Marzana couldn't blame her. Honora's feet pounded up the stairs. Her face, when it appeared in the doorway, was pale. Begging your pardon, Captain, but there's someone here to see you. Not Nick, then? Marzana's mother said. No, ma'am. Honora cleared her throat. The gentleman's downstairs asked me to give you this. Says he's sorry to visit so late. Didn't sound sorry, though, she added in an undertone as she passed Mrs. Hacklebaron a white calling card. There was no name on the little rectangle, just a single silhouette in matte black. It was heraldic in its simplicity, a bird with its wings stretched and upraised fan-like on either side of its long serpentine neck. Speak of the devil, Marzana's mother murmured. The snake bird had come to call. Oh my gosh, it's getting so good. Ah!